On Peck Street in New Haven, Connecticut, there is a complex of old brick buildings that stretches for nearly a full city block. The buildings are solid, well constructed, the kind that were built to last a century. Today, artists rent studio space there. A cafe operates on the ground floor. Painters hang work in the hallways. It is a pleasant place, quiet and creative, and just a little melancholy. The sign out front reads Erector Square. That name is not an accident. It is a memorial. For 5 decades, those same buildings housed one of the most remarkable manufacturing operations in American history. At its peak, in the early 1950s, the A.C. Gilbert Company employed 2,500 workers on that site alone, more people than many small towns, and produced educational toys that were shipped to every state in the country and dozens of countries beyond. The Erector Set, the company's iconic steel construction kit, had sold more than 30 million units by the mid-1930s. The chemistry sets, the microscopes, the telescope kits, the American Flyer model trains, together they generated $20 million in annual revenue by 1953, the equivalent of more than $220 million today. Gilbert was not just a toy company, it was an institution. For 2 full generations of American boys, it was the factory where their sense of what was possible, what they might build, invent, understand, was first ignited. Then, in the space of 6 years, it was gone. By 1967, the A.C. Gilbert Company had filed for bankruptcy. The Erector Square factory went silent. 2,500 jobs vanished from New Haven's Fairhaven neighborhood in what felt like a single breath. The brand, that name, that legacy, those red steel boxes with their gleaming metal girders was sold for essentially nothing to a company that had no idea what it actually represented. What happened? How does a company that had spent 50 years building the scientific imagination of an entire nation collapse within a single decade? And is the story really about management mistakes and market shifts? Or is it about something deeper, something about what happens when a company is so completely the extension of one man's personality that the two cannot be separated? The answer, it turns out, is both. And it is more instructive than you might expect. The story begins not in New Haven, Connecticut, but in Salem, Oregon, in 1884. And it begins, appropriately enough, with a competition. Alfred Carlton Gilbert was born on February 15, 1884, the middle son of Frank Newton Gilbert, a banker with pioneer roots in the Willamette Valley, and Charlotte Ann Hovenden Gilbert. Salem in 1884 was still a frontier town in many respects, a place shaped by the demands of practical survival, where self-reliance was not an aspiration, but a daily requirement. Frank Gilbert was a successful man by local standards, which meant comfortable but not wealthy, respected but not grand. The family attended a strict Congregationalist church. Discipline was expected. Idleness was not tolerated. Alfred was, by his own later account, physically frail as a very young child. He was small and slight, and reports of childhood illness followed him into adulthood as part of his personal mythology, though he himself disputed them vigorously. "No sick or weak boy could have done all the things I did," he wrote in his 1954 autobiography, The Man Who Lives in Paradise. What is certain is that by age 7, he had already decided that physical limitations were problems to be solved through effort rather than accepted through resignation. He trained for 2 weeks before entering a local tricycle race. He won. It was a pattern that would define the rest of his life. Identify an obstacle, apply systematic preparation, overcome it through sheer competitive will. The family relocated to Moscow, Idaho when Alfred was around 10, a farming community even more demanding than Salem in terms of physical self-reliance. By his mid-teens, Gilbert had transformed himself into a genuinely exceptional athlete. At Tualatin Academy in Forest Grove, Oregon, he collected more than 100 trophies in football, wrestling, boxing, and track and field. He organized the track team himself. He raised money to build a grandstand. Then, he went out and won most of the events. But alongside the athletics, there was always the magic. When Gilbert was around 10 years old, a traveling magician named Herman the Great came through Salem. Alfred's father, who knew the hotel manager where the magician was staying, arranged for his son to be called up from the audience to assist on stage. What happened next tells you everything about the kind of man Gilbert would become. Rather than simply assisting, Alfred demonstrated his own card tricks backstage and impressed Herman enough to be invited for a private tutorial. He was 10 years old. He had identified something he wanted: access to expertise, to the inner workings of a craft, and he had found a way to get it. Magic and athletics seem like an odd combination, but they share a common logic that Gilbert understood intuitively. Both require absolute mastery of physical mechanics, both reward relentless practice, and both are ultimately performances for an audience whose delight is the measure of your success. A magician who fumbles the trick has failed. An athlete who crosses the line second has lost. Gilbert operated at the intersection of these two disciplines his entire life, and the toy company he would eventually build was, in its deepest essence, a performance, a sustained act of wonder directed at children. In 1902, Gilbert transferred from Pacific University to Yale, financing his medical education by performing as a professional magician. He was simultaneously studying anatomy and performing sleight-of-hand shows. He was breaking world records in the pole vault. He held the intercollegiate wrestling championship in the 135-pound class. His doctoral thesis was titled, with characteristic Gilbert directness, "The Genito-Urinary Phenomena of Athletes." He received his medical degree in 1909. He never practiced medicine for a single day. Here is the thing about Alfred Carlton Gilbert that makes him so fascinating as a character. He was not someone who pursued greatness abstractly. He pursued it through specific, physical, measurable acts. Every achievement in his life, the athletic records, the Olympic medal, the company he built, came from the same source: an almost pathological need to take a problem apart, understand its mechanics, and then solve it better than anyone else had. That quality made him an extraordinary builder. It also made him constitutionally incapable of letting go. In 1908, while still a Yale medical student, Alfred Carlton Gilbert traveled to London for the Summer Olympics. He was 24 years old, the reigning world record holder in the pole vault, and he was about to encounter a situation that perfectly illustrated both his greatest strength and the quality that would, decades later, become his greatest liability. British Olympic officials, who harbored a certain proprietary attitude toward athletics they considered their own, refused to allow Gilbert to use his spikeless bamboo pole, an innovation he had developed himself, which allowed for greater flexibility and higher clearance. They also objected to his practice of digging a small hole at the base of the standards to anchor his pole, again, his own invention, again the product of systematic problem-solving rather than tradition. Gilbert competed with the traditional wooden pole and spike. He still tied for gold with his American teammate, Edward Cook, at 12 feet 2 inches, setting a new Olympic record in the process. The British officials, in what remains a disputed decision, awarded both athletes gold medals without a jump-off. It is still the only tie for gold in Olympic pole vault history. The bamboo pole that cost him sole recognition at the Olympics went on to become the standard. The hole-in-the-ground technique became the forerunner of the modern vaulting box. Gilbert was right. The officials were wrong. But being right wasn't enough to win in that particular room, on that particular day. He filed it away and moved on. In 1909, Gilbert borrowed $5,000 from his father, roughly $170,000 in today's terms, and co-founded the Misto Manufacturing Company in New Haven, Connecticut, with a machinist and friend named John Petrie. The division of labor was immediately clear. Petrie made things, Gilbert sold them. The company produced magic kits for children and professionals, boxed sets containing cards, rings, wands, instruction books, the complete apparatus of wonder. Gilbert bought out Petrie within a few years. The company was already his in all but name. The invention of the Erector Set arrived the way Gilbert's best ideas always arrived, through observation and immediate translation into physical form. In 1911, riding the commuter train from New Haven to New York City, Gilbert watched the construction crews working along the tracks of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, which was in the process of electrifying its main line. The steel girders rising from the ground, precise, modular, interconnecting, captured his attention completely. That night, he and his wife Mary sat at their dining room table and cut cardboard into miniature girder shapes, adjusting proportions, testing sizes and angles. Then, Gilbert took the cardboard prototypes to a local toolmaker and had them reproduced in steel. The Erector Set, originally called the Misto Erector Structural Steel Builder, was introduced at the New York City Toy Fair in January 1913. It was not the first construction toy on the market. The British company Meccano had been selling a similar product since 1901. What Gilbert understood immediately and with crystal clarity was what Meccano's founder, Frank Hornby, had missed. American children in 1913 were growing up surrounded by the most dramatic construction boom in the nation's history. Bridges, skyscrapers, rail electrification, steel. Everywhere they looked, the future was being assembled from interlocking metal pieces. Gilbert gave them the chance to do it themselves. The Erector Set flew off the shelves. Christmas 1913 sold out in Connecticut and New York. Gilbert immediately launched a national advertising campaign. Full-page spreads in newspapers and magazines, direct mail to toy stores, promotional displays in department store windows. By 1915, the Erector Set had won a gold medal at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco. By 1916, Gilbert had renamed the company after himself, moved operations to a larger facility on Peck Street in New Haven's Fairhaven neighborhood, and become the first president of the Toy Manufacturers of America, an organization he had founded himself. Think about what that sequence actually represents. From cardboard prototypes at a kitchen table to the presidency of a national industry organization in 3 years. This was not luck. This was someone operating at full capacity across every dimension simultaneously. The moment that cemented Gilbert's national reputation came not from a toy, but from a meeting. In 1918, with America fully engaged in the First World War, the U.S. Council of National Defense was weighing a ban on toy production to redirect manufacturing capacity and materials to the war effort. The council summoned Gilbert to Washington to make the case for why toys should be considered non-essential. He arrived with a suitcase full of products and stood before a room of government officials. He demonstrated each toy. He explained, product by product, how chemistry sets taught the principles that trained chemists and engineers, how construction toys developed the spatial reasoning and mechanical aptitude that built modern infrastructure, how the toy industry employed thousands of workers who would otherwise be competing for the same labor as munitions manufacturers. The council voted not to ban toy production. The Post ran a photograph of Gilbert with an Erector Set above a single caption, "The Man Who Saved Christmas." Between 1918 and the early 1930s, the A.C. Gilbert Company expanded in every direction simultaneously, and the pattern of growth reveals a mind that was systematically solving a single large problem. How do you build a company whose product is children's imagination? The answer, in Gilbert's formulation, was that you do it the same way you build a vault box or an Erector Set girder, through precision engineering of interlocking components, each one designed to support the others. By the early 1920s, the product line extended far beyond the original Erector Set. Chemistry sets arrived in 1922, co-developed with Sterling professor Treat Baldwin Johnson of Yale's chemistry department, not because Gilbert needed an academic credential, but because he understood that the presence of a Yale chemist in the instruction manuals gave parents confidence that the science was real. Microscope kits, telescope sets, radio receivers, mineralogy collections. Each product was built on the same philosophy. Give children actual working instruments, not toy approximations. A Gilbert chemistry set contained real reagents. A Gilbert microscope produced real magnification. The Geiger counter in the atomic energy lab, we'll get to that, was a functional scientific instrument. The factory on Peck Street expanded into a 5-block complex that Gilbert named, with typical directness, Erector Square. By the mid-1930s, the facility employed up to 2,500 workers during peak production. And peak production meant the months running up to Christmas, when the assembly lines ran day and night. A C. Gilbert Company was the largest employer in New Haven. Not one of the largest, Gilbert ran the operation the way a field commander runs a campaign, with personal presence, obsessive attention to quality, and an instinct for the specific detail that was actually important. He visited the night shift once a week. He stood in the cafeteria line with the employees. He called them co-workers, never employees, and he almost always came away from those visits with something he wanted to change or improve. The company had a credit union, offered free legal advice, threw annual Christmas parties for workers' children. There was no union at Gilbert. Gilbert didn't believe there needed to be, and for decades he was right. The workers agreed. He did it for the satisfaction of competition and to accomplish his goal more than he did it for money, remembered Herb Pierce, who served as Gilbert's plant superintendent for years. The company reached its peak around 1953, with Pierce overseeing some 2,000 of the 2,500 total employees in his production department alone. To put that scale in perspective, 2,500 workers in a single factory complex in a mid-sized New England city, all making educational toys. This was not a niche operation. It was a cornerstone of a regional economy. The American Flyer acquisition in 1938 was characteristic of Gilbert's method. American Flyer was a Chicago-based model train manufacturer that had been struggling to compete with Lionel, the industry's dominant player. Gilbert saw an opportunity that was not immediately obvious. While Lionel operated on a 3-rail track system that was electrically convenient but physically unrealistic, Gilbert believed he could differentiate American Flyer by switching to 2-rail track the way actual trains ran. He moved the entire operation from Chicago to New Haven, retooled the manufacturing process, and repositioned American Flyer as the more authentic, more precisely engineered alternative to Lionel. It worked. For a generation, American Flyer and Lionel competed for the same living room floor space under every American Christmas tree. 2-rail versus 3-rail became something model railroad enthusiasts argued about with genuine passion, which is to say, Gilbert had managed the remarkable feat of turning a product specification into a cultural identity. What I find instructive about this period, the late 1930s through the early 1950s, is how much of Gilbert's success depended on things that were invisible from the outside. Not the products themselves, but the organizational culture that produced them, the quality standards enforced personally by the founder, the worker loyalty built through genuine respect rather than paternalistic theater, The manufacturing expertise accumulated over decades in a single facility with the same equipment and the same people. These are the things that can't be purchased or imported or replicated overnight. They take generations to build. They can be destroyed in months. By 1924, the Erector Set had been completely redesigned. The new version contained more than 70 different parts and was marketed under the headline, "The New Erector, the World's Greatest Toy." It was not false advertising. What made the Erector Set genuinely extraordinary, and what made it different from every other construction toy of its era, was the combination of mechanical complexity and open-ended possibility. The numbered model sets in the catalog could guide a child through building a truck, a steam shovel, a power plant, a complete amusement park with a working Ferris wheel, a parachute drop ride, a carousel, all motorized. But the real point was that none of those catalog models was the ceiling. The pieces were standardized and interchangeable. With the right combination of erector parts and sufficient ingenuity, you could build almost anything. The DC motors that came with the larger sets were not toy motors in the diminished sense of that phrase. They were small, functional electric motors capable of driving actual mechanical work. The gears, pulleys, and cams were precision manufactured to real tolerances. A child who spent a year working through the Erector Set catalog was not playing at engineering. He was learning it, one iteration at a time. The sets ranged in price from $1 to $525. That upper end, $525 in 1920s dollars, which is roughly $9,000 today, was for a set so comprehensive it could be used to build a working model of virtually any machine then in commercial operation. Gilbert never apologized for the price range or tried to hide it. He advertised it directly, because the existence of a $525 set told the serious parent and the ambitious child something important. This is not a fad. This is a system. By the mid-1930s, Gilbert had sold more than 30 million Erector Sets in the United States alone. The number is almost difficult to process. 30 million individual families, 30 million children sitting on living room floors assembling steel girders. 30 million small minds learning in the most concrete and physical way possible that complex structures are built from simple, well-designed components, assembled according to a logic that can be understood. Here is the thing that strikes me most about this period. Gilbert was not primarily selling a product. He was selling a worldview. The Erector Set was a physical argument for the proposition that the world is buildable, that machinery, infrastructure, technology, the entire material civilization of the 20th century was not mysterious or beyond reach, but was instead the product of understandable principles that any child could begin to grasp. That is an extraordinarily powerful idea to embed in a toy. It is also, in retrospect, the key to understanding exactly why the company's eventual collapse was so total and so irreversible. In 1941, Gilbert opened the Gilbert Hall of Science at 200 Fifth Avenue in New York City, in the heart of the Toy District. Part showroom, part science museum, it was designed to do exactly what it sounds like, to make science accessible and exciting in physical, hands-on terms. Children could come in, handle products, conduct experiments, watch demonstrations. It was an early version of what we would now call an experiential retail space, but that framing misses the point. For Gilbert, it was not primarily a retail strategy. It was a mission statement made physical. Gilbert realized the country needed engineers and scientists to develop new technology, notes the A.C. Gilbert Heritage Society. And in 1941, with the world at war and the Manhattan Project already underway in secret, that realization was not abstract. It was urgent. The wartime years tested Gilbert's company in specific and revealing ways. Metal rationing meant that full Erector sets could not be manufactured in standard form. Gilbert's response was characteristic. He developed Victory versions made from scrap materials and tongue depressors, wooden Erector Junior sets that preserved the educational logic of the original while complying with wartime restrictions. He received Army-Navy E awards for the company's contributions to defense manufacturing. He adapted without abandoning the core product philosophy. Then, the war ended. The baby boom began. And Gilbert looked at the landscape of post-war America, the nuclear age, the Cold War, the nation's suddenly urgent need for scientists and engineers, and made a product decision that was simultaneously the most ambitious and the most telling of his career. In 1950, the A.C. Gilbert Company introduced the U-238 Atomic Energy Lab. The set retailed for $49.50, approximately $650 in today's terms, and contained the most extraordinary collection of items ever assembled in a toy box. A working Geiger counter, a Wilson cloud chamber capable of making the paths of individual alpha particles visible to the naked eye, a spinthariscope showing radioactive disintegration on a fluorescent screen, an electroscope, 4 glass jars containing actual uranium-bearing ore samples, automite, torbernite, uraninite, carnotite, sourced from the Colorado Plateau, a 60-page instruction manual written by Dr. Ralph Lapp, a physicist who had worked on the Manhattan Project, a comic book explaining atomic theory co-authored with General Leslie Groves, director of the Manhattan Project, and John Dunning, the physicist who had helped verify uranium fission. The set had been developed at the explicit encouragement of the U.S. government, which believed it would help build public understanding of atomic energy and emphasize its constructive peacetime applications. The Atomic Energy Commission licensed Gilbert to purchase the uranium ore and certified the set's safety. Oak Ridge Laboratories verified the radiation levels were within acceptable parameters. Gilbert called it the most spectacular of their new educational toys. In his 1954 autobiography, he wrote that the government's encouragement had been a significant factor in its development. Fewer than 5,000 sets were sold. The product was discontinued after 2 years. The U-238 Atomic Energy Lab is the single most instructive failure in Gilbert's history, not because the product was wrong exactly, but because of what its failure revealed. At $49.50, it was priced beyond what most families would spend on a single toy, no matter how spectacular. The instruction manual, written by a Manhattan Project physicist, was too sophisticated for the company's typical audience of 8 to 12-year-olds. And the American public, which had spent the previous 5 years learning to associate uranium with destruction on a civilizational scale, was not enthusiastic about bringing samples of it into their living rooms, regardless of what Oak Ridge Laboratories had certified. Gilbert had made the product he believed in, rather than the product the market was ready for. It is a distinction he had navigated successfully for 40 years. This time, he read the room wrong. What's remarkable, in retrospect, is how clearly the Atomic Energy Lab's failure pointed toward the challenge Gilbert would face in the decade ahead. The world was changing faster than the company's core assumptions, and the man at the center of those assumptions was getting older. The early 1950s represent the absolute zenith of the A.C. Gilbert Company, a period in which all the accumulated advantages of 4 decades converged into something that felt, from the inside, like permanent dominance. By 1953, annual revenues had reached $20 million. The Erector Square factory employed 2,500 workers. American Flyer was a genuine competitor to Lionel. The chemistry sets, microscopes, and telescope kits controlled a commanding share of the educational toy market. The company had established itself not just as a manufacturer, but as a brand with a specific cultural identity, Gilbert meant quality. Gilbert meant science. Gilbert meant the serious education of serious children. That identity had real market value. Parents, who had themselves grown up with Erector Sets, there were by this point 2 full generations of them, bought Gilbert products for their own children with the confidence of inherited trust. The brand was, in the most literal sense, a piece of transmitted culture. A C. Gilbert ran his company the way he had always run everything, with personal presence and obsessive attention to operational quality. Herb Pierce, his plant superintendent, recalled that Gilbert visited the night shift once a week and almost always found something to improve. The company's broad range of manufacturing equipment, big presses, screw machines, die casting, tool making, gave it a flexibility that pure assembly operations lacked. When a product needed to be redesigned, the capability to do it was in-house. But there were signals, visible in retrospect, even if they were invisible at the time. Gilbert had retired in 1954, handing the presidency to his son, Alfred Carlton Gilbert Jr. This was not a clean transition. A C. Sr. was constitutionally incapable of stepping back. "What I'll probably do is compromise and become chairman of the board," he said. "I'm afraid I'd feel lost if I dropped out of this race." Junior had spent years operating in his father's considerable shadow, and the employees who had built their careers around their personal relationship with AC Sr. did not transfer that loyalty automatically. Employees resist succession because of their desire to maintain their personal relationship with the founder, noted a later analysis of the company's collapse. The affection for AC was real. The authority of AC Jr. was contested. Meanwhile, the toy industry was beginning to change in ways that had nothing to do with Gilbert's particular strengths. Plastic was arriving as a manufacturing material, cheaper than steel, lighter, capable of bright colors that photographed well in the new medium of television advertising. Mattel introduced the first toy advertised on national television in 1955. The logic of the toy market was quietly shifting from quality at retail to recognition on screen. Gilbert's products were not designed to be seen on television. They were designed to be held in your hands and assembled at a table. That difference mattered less and less as the decade continued. Alfred Carlton Gilbert died on January 24, 1961, at the age of 76. He had been ill for some time. In his final years, he spent most of his time at Paradise Farm, his 600-acre estate in North Haven, the property with the dairy herd, the champion German shepherds, the hunting grounds, the golf holes, the estate that had been his reward to himself for 50 years of competitive intensity. The business obituaries that followed his death described him accurately as a builder of one of the great American toy companies. What they could not fully capture, because the consequences would not become clear for another 6 years, was the degree to which the company was, in the most fundamental operational sense, indistinguishable from the man himself. Quality control at Gilbert had never been a system in the modern sense. It had been a personality, and specifically, C's personality, his weekly night shift visits, his eye for the detail that was off, his willingness to halt production rather than ship something that didn't meet his standard. When AC Sr. retired and then died, that personality was gone. The systems that should have replaced it were not yet fully developed, because the man who should have developed them had spent 50 years making them unnecessary through his own presence. This is the pattern that recurs throughout the history of founder-led companies, and it is worth stating plainly. The qualities that make a founder capable of building something extraordinary are often exactly the qualities that make it difficult for the thing to survive him. Gilbert's relentless personal involvement in every aspect of the company was the source of its operational excellence and the source of its succession crisis simultaneously. You cannot have one without the other. A C. Gilbert Jr. had assumed the presidency in 1954 and had managed the company competently through the latter part of that decade. But competent management of a company that runs on the founder's charisma is a very different challenge than transforming that company into something that can run without the charisma. Junior was attempting the second task without having fully completed the first. When AC Sr. died in 1961, the family decided to sell. The buyer was Jack Rather, a Texas oil heir turned entertainment entrepreneur whose portfolio included the Disneyland Hotel in Anaheim, the rights to the Lassie television program, the Lone Ranger franchise, a portfolio of radio and television stations, and what he described as an eye for leisure industry growth opportunities. The family sold all 144,000 shares to the Rather Corporation of California. The price was not publicly disclosed, but it represented a complete exit. The Gilbert family was out. What Rather saw when he looked at AC Gilbert Company was a leisure company, a toy company in the post-war era of rising disposable income and expanding consumer culture was, in his formulation, a growth business, a vehicle for reaching the growing middle class with products for their growing families. He was not entirely wrong about the macro trend. He was catastrophically wrong about what kind of company Gilbert actually was and what it needed to continue functioning. Here is where the story gets genuinely instructive. Rather did not destroy the Gilbert Company through malice or ignorance of business in general. He destroyed it by applying a perfectly reasonable framework from one industry to a company that operated on entirely different principles. Rather installed a new CEO named Quinlan, who knew entertainment but knew nothing about the toy manufacturing industry. He redesigned the product line to be more modern, which in practice meant replacing precision-engineered metal components with lower quality parts that photographed better in catalogs and could be produced more cheaply. He contracted with Marvin Glass, a well-regarded toy inventor, to develop flashier, more television-ready products. In 1963, Rather was betting heavily on a major television advertising campaign for the Christmas season. He had negotiated an alliance with Pepsi-Cola for cross-promotional marketing. He had arranged for Quaker Oats to sell Gilbert toys on consignment through its distribution network. The strategy was coherent, modern, aggressive, and it collapsed completely. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The country went into mourning. Network television suspended advertising. The Christmas shopping season essentially stopped. Quaker Oats, unable to sell the Gilbert inventory it had taken on consignment, returned a massive backlog of stock to the company. The Pepsi alliance produced nothing. The television campaign never ran. It is important to be honest about what November 1963 represented. It was a catastrophic external event entirely beyond anyone's control that dealt a devastating blow to a company that was already financially stressed. The Kennedy assassination did not cause the Gilbert Company's collapse, but it accelerated a process that might otherwise have taken 3 or 4 more years to reach its conclusion. And in doing so, it eliminated the time that might have allowed for a course correction. In the first year of Rather's ownership, the company lost approximately $3 million. As Herb Pierce put it simply, that was something that had never happened before in the 50-year history of Gilbert. In the following years, the losses continued, up to $17 million over the 5-year span of Rather's ownership. The quality of the products declined visibly. The workers who had built their careers around AC's personal standards began to leave. The manufacturing expertise that had been the company's invisible foundation, the decades of accumulated skill in those Peck Street buildings, began to dissipate. Most companies would have adapted, not because adaptation is easy, but because the alternative is extinction, and the survival instinct is powerful. What made Gilbert's collapse so complete was that the things Rather needed to save it, The engineering culture, the quality standards, the worker loyalty, the brand identity built on scientific seriousness were precisely the things his approach to running the company was systematically dismantling. Let's be precise about the timeline, because precision is what Gilbert always demanded, and it seems right to apply it here. 1961, A.C. Gilbert Sr. dies. The family sells to Rather. 1962, Rather takes operational control. New management installs. First-year losses of approximately $3 million, the first losses in 50 years of company history. 1963, the Kennedy assassination devastates the Christmas season and collapses the Quaker Oats consignment deal. The Pepsi co-marketing alliance fails to materialize. 1964, A.C. Gilbert Jr., who had taken the ceremonial position of chairman of the board under Rather, dies of a brain tumor. He was in his mid-40s. The last member of the Gilbert family with any operational connection to the company is gone. 1965, the company produces James Bond movie tie-in products, figures, and a slot car road race set featuring Bond's Aston Martin DB5. This is not, in itself, a wrong decision. Licensed products can be profitable, and the Bond franchise was at its cultural peak in 1965. But it represents a fundamental repositioning of what Gilbert was supposed to be. From a company that built children's scientific imagination to a company that sold entertainment tie-ins. The brand logic, accumulated over 5 decades, was being quietly liquidated. 1966. Losses continue. Workers leave. The quality of remaining products deteriorates. The Erector Set itself, the founding product, the 30 million unit bestseller, is now being made with parts of noticeably reduced precision. Collectors who acquired sets from this period consistently describe them as inferior to the pre-war and early post-war versions. 1967. The A.C. Gilbert Company files for bankruptcy. The Erector Square factory goes silent. 2,500 jobs vanish from Fairhaven. The Erector brand was sold to Gabriel Industries for essentially $0. The company agreed to pay royalties on future sales rather than an upfront price. American Flyer was sold to Gilbert's old competitor Lionel, the company that AC had spent 30 years positioning as the inferior alternative. The Gilbert name itself continued to appear on products through 1976, but those products had no meaningful connection to what the name had represented. The parallel with what happened to Polaroid decades later is hard not to notice. A company built around a specific, distinctive product philosophy, sustained by a founder's personal vision, failing to make the transition to a new competitive environment, not because the vision was wrong, but because no one was able to institutionalize it in time. The lesson is not that founders should step back earlier. The lesson is that the institutionalization of a company's core values has to happen while the founder is still present, not as a crisis measure when succession is imminent, but as a continuous process woven into the ordinary operations of the company. A.C. Gilbert never initiated that process, not because he didn't understand it, but because he genuinely believed, right up to the day he wrote his autobiography in 1954, that the race was still on and he was still running it. Every company collapse contains within it a set of lessons. The better ones contain lessons that extend far beyond the specific industry, the specific era, the specific cast of characters. The Gilbert story contains 4. The first lesson is about what quality actually means organizationally. For 50 years, A.C. Gilbert Company was synonymous with quality. But quality at Gilbert was never a documented system, a set of measurable standards, a process that could be trained into new employees from a manual. It was A.C. Gilbert walking the night shift. It was his personal authority stopping a production run that wasn't right. It was the accumulated cultural understanding among the workers on Peck Street of what good enough was not. When the man left, the quality went with him, not because his workers didn't care, but because the organizational infrastructure for maintaining quality without him had never been built. What Rather's team inherited was not a quality-producing system, but the memory of quality produced by a specific person. Those are entirely different things. Every company that runs on a founder's personal standards faces this same cliff edge. The question is not whether to invest in systematizing quality, but when. The answer is always before you need to, not after. The second lesson is about the difference between industry knowledge and general business acumen. Jack Rather was not a fool. He had built a successful media company. He understood leverage, licensing, and the mechanics of entertainment businesses with real sophistication. But the toy manufacturing industry in 1962, particularly the high-precision educational toy manufacturing industry, was not interchangeable with the entertainment industry. The supply chains were different. The retail dynamics were different. The consumer psychology was different. The manufacturing expertise required was different. Rather applied entertainment business logic to a manufacturing problem and got a manufacturing disaster. His new management team didn't know anything about the toy industry, as Herb Pierce put it. This is a failure that recurs across industries whenever a company is acquired by someone who sees the financial profile and assumes the operational complexity is similarly generic. It is not. It never is. The operational expertise that generates the financial profile is inseparable from the specific knowledge accumulated in the specific domain. The third lesson is about succession, and it is the hardest one. A.C. Gilbert knew, in some theoretical sense, that he would eventually need to hand the company to someone else. He handed it to his son, which was a reasonable choice. He did not hand his son any of the organizational infrastructure, accumulated authority, or institutional processes that would have allowed Junior to actually lead with the same effectiveness. And then he refused to genuinely step back, leaving AC Jr. in the impossible position of being nominally in charge while everyone in the building understood that the real authority still belonged to AC Sr. The result was that the company never fully made the succession transition while it still had time to do so. When AC Sr. died in 1961, the company had not one successor with genuine authority, but a leadership vacuum dressed in family continuity. The sale to Rather was the consequence of that vacuum, a distressed transaction driven by the family's inability to figure out what to do next. What would have saved Gilbert is the same thing that saves most founder-led companies: a decade or more of deliberate, systematic investment in building an institution that can survive the founder. Not a ceremonial handoff, not a title change. An actual transfer of authority, culture, and institutional knowledge, slow, uncomfortable, conducted while the founder is still present to mentor rather than to decide. The fourth lesson belongs specifically to Gilbert, and it is the most poignant. A.C. Gilbert built a company around a very specific philosophical proposition: that children's play should be educational in the deepest sense, that toys should be genuine instruments of scientific discovery, that a child given real tools and real challenges would be better prepared for the real world. He held that proposition through 5 decades and 2 world wars. He never wavered on it. That conviction was his greatest strength and the source of his greatest vulnerability. A company built around a founder's sincere philosophical conviction is extraordinarily difficult to preserve through ownership transfer, because the conviction is not an asset that can be packaged and sold. Jack Rather looked at the AC. Gilbert Company and saw a toy company with strong brand recognition and manufacturing infrastructure. He did not see, could not see, the philosophical engine that had produced those assets. And without understanding it, he could not sustain it. The brand survived the man's death by 6 years. The conviction survived the man's death by exactly 0. On Peck Street in New Haven's Fair Haven neighborhood, the old factory buildings still stand. The brickwork is solid, the structures sound. Erector Square, as it is now known, houses artist studios and a cafe and creative small businesses. On certain weekends in October, artists open their studios to visitors. It is a genuinely pleasant place. Light-filled, quietly purposeful, full of people making things with their hands. The Erector name still exists. Meccano, the British construction toy company that was A.C. Gilbert's earliest competitor, eventually acquired the brand. The Erector Set is sold today as a premium construction toy, manufactured with modern materials, marketed to a niche market of enthusiasts and STEM-oriented parents. It is a respectable product. It is nowhere near the cultural phenomenon it once was. American Flyer is now a product line within the Lionel catalog, exactly the fate A.C. Gilbert had spent 30 years trying to prevent. The Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Lab, those fewer than 5,000 sets that sold so poorly in 1950 that they nearly bankrupted a product category, are now collector's items that sell at auction for between $5,000 and $16,500. The complete, intact ones are extraordinarily rare. Most of the radioactive materials have decayed to negligible levels. The Geiger counters still work. There is something appropriate about the way Alfred Carlton Gilbert is remembered today, not primarily as a failed business, but as an embodiment of a particular American moment, the mid-20th century, when the country genuinely believed that science was salvation, that an engineer's mind was the most valuable thing a child could develop, that the right toy in the right hands could change what a life became. Thousands of engineers, scientists, and inventors have cited Erector Sets as the beginning of their technical education. The company produced its own successor generation in the most literal way, by putting its products in their hands before they were old enough to understand what was being built. What A.C. Gilbert built in those brick buildings on Peck Street was not, in the end, a company. It was a machine for producing engineers. The company collapsed. The engineers remained. Some things are larger than the institutions that create them. The Erector Set, at its best, was one of those things. A simple idea, precisely engineered, open-ended enough to contain whatever a child's ambition could imagine. The fact that it now survives in a diminished form, under different ownership, in a changed market, does not diminish what it was. It only reminds us how rare it is to build something that genuinely matters, and how insufficient even that is without the structures to carry it forward when the builder is gone.